All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's public talk, What Hope for Humanity, brought to you as part of the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas public talk series. Today we're meeting and broadcasting on land that is known as Lutruwita, Tasmania, Aboriginal Seas and Waterways. As a reflection of our institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of the island, the University of Tasmania wants to acknowledge the traditional owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, the Palawa people. The Palawa people are the traditional custodians of the land from which we're broadcasting today, originally named Pataway. And we stand on the shores today as they once did. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and those who did not make elder status. We acknowledge a deep history of storytelling, knowledge sharing, and caring for the land. And we stand for the future that profoundly respects, acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history, and the continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way to a strong future. My name is Daryl Stelmack, and I'm a lecturer in emergency management here at the University of Tasmania at the Cradle Coast campus in Burnie. Prior to joining the university, I spent 20 years as a humanitarian aid worker, and I've witnessed firsthand some of the situations that we'll be discussing tonight. So this is a session that will have both professional and personal interest for me. So, on behalf of University of Tasmania, I'd like to give a sincere welcome to you all, whether you're here in person or joining us from the comfort of your home. The Island of Ideas lecture series started in 2020, around the time of the pandemic, as a way of connecting our communities on the island together during that period of suspended ongoing face-to-face events. So we've continued the program in 2023, although we're playing with the style, making it more of a hybrid open style. These conversations are really important for the university community because they're part of our collegiality, part of the community that we're trying to build, and part of our links and relations with the rest of the population in Tasmania. So they're really core to our values as a university. We're bringing this conversation to you from Burnie tonight as a testament to the amazing people that live and work here. I would like to say we'll be dealing with some material that can be quite confronting at times, so please do be aware of that. So without further ado, let's begin. I guess I would like to start by, on a personal note, by welcoming all of the speakers here tonight. Professor Tim McCormack is Professor of International Law at the University of Tasmania. He's a Special Advisor on War Crimes to the Prosecutor of the International Court, and Criminal Court rather, at The Hague. And he's also a local Burnie boy. So welcome to you, Tim.
Thanks.
Cheryl Durant is the former Director of Preparedness and Mobilization for the Australian Department of Defence. She's a member of the Global Military Advisor Council on Climate Change, and she's also a Burnie local. So welcome to you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Darren.
Dr. Matt Killingsworth is Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Tasmania, former Chair of the Tasmanian Red Cross International Humanitarian Law Committee, and he's our token Hobart intellectual.
Yeah, not from Burnie.
We won't hold it against you. So the world undeniably is changing, and it's changing fast. From the war in the Ukraine to militarization in Asia Pacific, through to the inflationary crisis, through to the pandemic, all of these individual crises are happening, and what's more, they're simultaneously driving one another. So the war in the Ukraine drives up the price of food and oil, which results in inflation here in Australia, which then has knock-on cascading effects throughout the rest of the world. So these cascading crises give us the impression, perhaps, that we're living in an age of collapse, in an age when the structures that we use to manage global affairs are no longer fit for purpose. And it's really hard to imagine what remaking that global system might look like. But that's what we're here to discuss tonight. So when we're talking about these giant global problems, it's always good to anchor them in the local and to see the relevance for local life. I think it's worth noting, as I did, that 3 of the 4 people standing in front of you tonight are Burnie locals. Tim was born and raised here, while Cheryl and I are recent imports. but I was speaking with Cheryl a few weeks ago, and we realized that we came here for the same reason. We moved to Burnie for the same reason. We both made the decision to move to Burnie in the Northwest Coast because it's one of the few places in the world that will be somewhat insulated from the effects of climate change and global turbulence. So we're both here as a form of climate refuge or refuge from instability. Now, a few years ago, people would have called that an alarmist attitude, but I don't find a lot of people telling me I'm an alarmist anymore. Cheryl and I might be among some of the first people to make that decision, but we certainly won't be among the last. And I'd suggest that on the island of Tasmania, we're going to see a population explosion, the likes of which we've never seen before in the coming 10 or 20 years. Now, that will bring both opportunities and it'll bring dangers. We need to think through, what does that look like for infrastructure? What does that look like for economies? What does that look like for the intellectual capital that we'll have here as a society? Those are all the challenges that we face together as an island state. How do we organize ourselves in the 21st century? And how do we rid ourselves of some of the 20th century assumptions that perhaps are no longer proving to serve us? That's our discussion tonight. So without further ado, I'll invite our first speaker, Cheryl, who's, as I said, a recent transplant and enthusiastic arrival to the Northwest Coast, to speak to us tonight. Over to you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Daryl. And thanks to the University of Tasmania for inviting me to speak today. I'd just like to add that I grew up in the South Island of New Zealand, so it wasn't actually too far a step to come to Burnie. I couldn't afford New Zealand anymore. It's been taken over by rich American preparedness people who've shot the house prices up, and sadly, or perhaps fortunately, I landed up in Burnie. So as a former intelligence officer, it's my job to kick off tonight with a quick tiki tour around the threats, those things that challenge us. And then in the typical way of intelligence officers, I'm also going to question the question and reframe the question into perhaps more a useful way for us. So the threats. Most of you probably know them, and we're increasingly hearing about them regularly in the news now. Even 5 years ago, you'd hear something about climate change perhaps once or twice a year. And now we're probably seeing things about climate change once or twice a week. And unfortunately, Daryl, we didn't get that latest report on Southern Ocean circulating currents. So perhaps we shouldn't have moved to Burnie. So nowhere really is completely immune. Also, some places are already experiencing profound change now, particularly in Africa and Asia. Now, as a member of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, what we're really concerned about is the big threats. So not threats to the economy, we can survive those. Not threats of minor wars, we can survive those, but basically what we call existential threats. So those are the big ones that threaten either the global civilization, which we're all part of, this sort of interconnected world that gives us all those wonderful material goods, the flow of oil around the planet, the flow of chips, our communication systems we rely on, the food we eat, pretty much everything now is part of a globalized system. So existential threats can cause that to collapse. But also at a bigger level, they might actually threaten humanity itself. And the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk in Oxford sort of looks at existential threats that may reduce humans to about 1 or 10% of their current population, which you can do a quick calculation, is a lot of unfortunate casualties. So from my perspective, there are really 3 big threats to humanity, and they sort of work together. So firstly, there's the one we've been living with for 50 years. So the fact that there is a threat doesn't mean it gets realised, and that's nuclear war. Humans have had the capacity to destroy humans or civilization for a long time, and we haven't. It's looking bad at the moment because there is, of course, the conflict in Ukraine, and also there's this, I call them the drongos with the bongos, beating the drums of war, as if war is a good thing to happen. It's never a good thing to happen. My uncle fought in World War II. He remembers what war was like. He says, don't go there. It's one of the few that are still surviving. Don't go there, he says. We forget the horrors that it brings, although those in Ukraine, no doubt, do not forget at the moment. So we've been managing this threat of war for a while. In fact, that's what the international organisations such as the United Nations were set up to manage. They've not done too bad a job of it. But then there's a new threat in town, and that's climate change. And by climate change, I'm also including the other environmental crises such as biodiversity loss, the fact that we've got waste all over the planet, a problem with plastic pollution, chemical pollutions. In fact, I think 6.5 now out of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. So we're really shitting in our own nest at the moment. There's a whole lot of environmental crises that are connected with each other, which climate change is the first cab off the block, I think, or the one with most prominence. And that also flows back into war, because in a time of crisis, when you are suffering the disasters, suffering the impacts on global food supply, that's also when humans tend to scrabble and fight for resources. So there is a link between environmental crises and conflict. And we've seen this before. We've seen this at times of other environmental stress. For example, the civilizations of Middle America, the Aztecs, the Maya in particular, some of the Indians, Anasazi Indians, all suffered under climate stress and went into a period of conflict and war. Although interestingly, they actually reframed their experience as survival, not collapse. So again, a lot of the way we approach this crisis will lead to how we come out of it or respond to it. And the third crisis is the one that has Elon Musk worried, which is artificial intelligence. And actually, that's the one that's got me worried more than everything else, because it actually threatens what it is to be human. So I said I'd reframe the question. I'm also a big sci-fi fan. And I think one of the Doctor Who's said, everything has an end. And if you think about it logically, at some point in time, the universe explodes, sun goes supernova, there is an end to humanity. So let's get over it. There is no hope. Don't worry about it. So it's not a sensible question in many ways. I think the more question is there, how do we respond to those crises in a way that retains our central humanity? Because actually none of those crises threatens my humanity. Doesn't threaten my joy of life, doesn't threaten my ability to be gracious, doesn't threaten my ability to share, doesn't threaten my ability to, hug my goddaughter. So in many ways, the crisis is actually framed by us all individually on how we want to respond. We don't have to respond with war. We don't have to respond with hate or fear. We can respond with joy. So one of my things about the climate crisis is put joy in. It's an odd thing to say about the climate crisis, but there's no use being miserable if you have the opportunity to not be miserable. So it makes sense to try and see the goodness. And many of the things that we're doing to deal with the climate crisis, such as living healthier lives, getting out more in nature, connecting more to community, are all things that puts joy back in life. And in many ways, what's suffering or what's most at threat is our inhuman systems. And these are the systems of governance that has evolved or been deliberately crafted, and that really control in many ways how our current economy and society act. And think about it, we're not really living in an age of humanity, we're living in an age of inhumanity. The United Nations is about nations, not about people. I'm actually working on a small project to create a complementary system called the United Peoples, which is about people. A lot of our economy, who cares about the economy? Another thing that is sort of the market, not a human thing that's supposed to be governing the economy. What about society and humans? Why shouldn't we be governing the economy? So again, we've created these inhuman institutions, corporations. Their job is to make profit. Their structures and laws and everything around them is set up to make profit. So we have all these inhuman institutions and organisations. And if these crises are threatening those things, I say bring it on, because we need to change. And a lot of the words are used are the words that begin with re or re. So we might be in a time of great regeneration. We might be in a time of great reconciliation or remaking. We can remake these institutions. We have this opportunity now. And the sort of, as we step up to the plate to face the future, we've got a choice about whether we just sort of continue to live in this inhuman age, which doesn't really value connections between society, that allows, I think there's 1 million people in New South Wales in poverty, below the poverty line. We have 3 million children in Australia who are in food insecurity. Do we really want to live in this world? And that's not really when climate change or war has even started or begin to bite in Australia. So I think this offers us a great opportunity to remake and regenerate, reconcile, possibly relinquish. And so for me, it's less a question about the doom and gloom and more about a question is, how can we take actions in our everyday life to start putting the good in? Now, I've just spoken about us individually, but of course a big problem is we have to solve those international organisations in governance, because otherwise we could do individually good things here, but we're still going to have problems with rogue actors, as we call in the military, or states that act without compassion or humanity. So I'm now going to hand over to Matt, who's going to talk about a little bit of those systems of international governance and how we got in this fine mess.
Thank you, Cheryl, for setting that up so beautifully and somewhat pessimistically. I think I might have a happier story to tell, perhaps, at the end of mine, that there might be a little bit of hope for humanity, perhaps. But Cheryl brilliantly spoke about the systems of governance that we turn to in times of crisis. And I thought that I would talk about where those systems came from, because they're the systems we still turn to. And they were created in an environment in which, at the middle of the 20th century, after half a century of unprecedented chaos and destruction, so a First World War, a Great Depression, and a Second World War, the winners or the Allied winners of the war came together and created a set of complementary institutions designed not to have any of the repeats of that chaotic and catastrophic part of the first half of the 20th century. Cheryl's already mentioned some of those institutions, and the first is the creation of the United Nations. Creation of the United Nations with a General Assembly where each nation state gets a representation, but also with a Security Council. And this is perhaps where we can start talking about some of the problems. A Security Council with 5 permanent members who have veto power, but again, recognizing that there is a reason why they were given veto power. So again, we will talk at some stage a little bit later about what the problems with that are. But Cheryl also spoke about our economic systems of governance. And so those other complementary institutions that were set up at the end of the Second World War are the so-called Bretton Woods institutions. What was then the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade, which subsequently became the World Trade Organization, the IMF and the World Bank, in response to the idea that it was economic crisis that had led to the rise of National Socialism or Nazism, and the idea that flattening out the world economy, stopping the huge peaks and troughs, was the way to avoid future conflict. And so we have these set of multilateral institutions, the UN, the Bretton Woods, that are set up in response to the first half of the 20th century. There's also a third set of institutions that are really important as well, this sort of golden era of multilateralism, where post-Second World War we have the creation or the coming together of things such as the 1949 Geneva Conventions, the Refugee Convention, Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Again, a series of multilateral institutions responding to these crises, multiple crises that characterize the first half of the 20th century. And I don't mean to sound naive, but there is a degree of altruism with the creation of these institutions. There is also a degree that they are designed by the Americans to serve American interests. There is a degree to that, of course there is. But there is also a degree to which the policymakers who did establish these institutions had the idea of peace and prosperity in their minds. And so initially they look good. The Cold War gets in the way. This is my potted history, 70 years of history in 15 minutes. The Cold War gets in the way, and many of these institutions are redundant because of the politics of realpolitik, the idea of reason of state dominating how the interaction between international relations works. And international order is understood through the prism of nuclear Armageddon and the possibility of nuclear Armageddon. And it's not until the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the implosion of the Soviet Union, where we get to see these institutions perhaps looking like they might work the way that they were designed. Iraq invades Kuwait. We have a UN Security Council resolution that isn't vetoed, which is brand new, fresh and exciting. And we have the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait. And the idea looks like that there is a rules-based order that is going to be achieved. And then even when it does look catastrophic, such as the horrendous events that happen in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, the Rwandan genocide, there is a response. There is a response through the establishment of institutions like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the idea that international order can come with a sense of justice as well. And then subsequently in 1998, that same decade, we have the establishment of the International Criminal Court. But this is also the decade at the end of the First World War, where we also have a new golden age of multilateralism as well. The idea, this is also the decade in which the Kyoto Protocol is created. And so the idea now that there is, outside of that prism of the fear of nuclear Armageddon, there is the capacity to respond to things such as climate change, injustice in war, and the idea, possibly, of increasing economic gaps between North and South. By the end of the decade, the story's not so optimistic. There are fears of American overstretch, that the conditionality aspects of the World Bank and the IMF in placing a neoliberal prism on the lendings of those institutions, sort of the creation of not necessarily a global humanity, as Cheryl was talking about, but the idea of making the world in the West in the image of the West. And this becomes problematic. And we also have subsequently the breakdown of some of those other institutions that I'm speaking about as well. And so one that I forgot to mention at the end of the Second World War, was the establishment of the European Union. The European Union, which comes out of the European coal and steel community, which then becomes the European Economic Community, then the European Community, and subsequently the European Union. Again, premised on the idea of breaking down borders, sharing resources, and the idea that this is a pathway to peace and prosperity. And so in that period that I've now spoken about and post, especially our next marker in my potted history, is the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where much of that optimism that we might have had about these things working the way that they were supposed to work, we have this retreat back into sovereignty or reason of state. And again, referring back to Cheryl's brilliant introduction, international politics starts getting framed not as framed through looking after humanity, it gets framed through security. And we see this in Australia, probably the best example, where the looking after of asylum seekers, which was once a human rights issue, becomes an issue that is framed by national security and has been tragically for the last 20 years. And we see the idea as well, even more so, and I think this theme runs true since the beginning of the Ukraine war, where we saw some progress with regards to responses to climate change in Glasgow. Yet at the most recent climate change conference in Egypt, the common message was, well, nothing can be done while there's a war in Ukraine. And so the idea again that sort of these threats that Cheryl was speaking about gets reduced to low politics. But here's my optimism.
Collingwood's going to win the flag.
They're 2-0, Tim, and they're going to go all right on Friday as well. But I digress. The focus I think that a lot of us have on these institutions, and I should note, the institutions might no longer be fit for purpose, and I'm really happy to have this discussion later. The UN Security Council is clearly broken. But having said that, the General Assembly seems to be reinvigorated. There are a number of really important votes, and we saw that this morning, another vote in the General Assembly sponsored by Vanuatu with respects to climate change. But we're also, I think, remiss of us to always necessarily focus on those institutions. The field that Tim and I work in, for example, we look at the war in Ukraine and look at the inhumanity of that particular conflict. But at the same time, we can also look at the extraordinary bravery of the people who are there. In fact, I'll give Bernie a plug here as well, one of the former students of, in fact, it's from Devonport actually, of Don College, Felicity Gray, who did honours in history at the University of Tasmania. She's one of many extraordinary people currently working in Ukraine and gathering evidence for possible war crimes tribunals. We see the same happening in Syria as well. And we also see that despite the fact that there is recalcitrance with regards to nation states responding to climate change, we have a number of non-state actors who are driving responses to climate change. And even in our own state of Tasmania, states like California in the United States, while President Trump was criminally negligent in his response to climate change, we had responsible states in the United States moving towards legislating to mitigate against the worst aspects of climate change. And so amongst all of, and returning to our question and returning to, again, Cheryl's excellent setup, while it's tempting to only ever look at those institutions that were designed in a post-conflict environment to ensure that we don't have future catastrophes, I don't think we need to necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater. That there is some value in those institutions, but there is also value in the impetus that those institutions provide for other actors to respond to the crises that we're currently experiencing. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And it's a pleasure to be speaking with Cheryl and also with Matt tonight. And thanks for the invitation. And for me, always a joy to be back in my hometown. Thanks for having me. My task is quite a challenging one, to think about the threats and the challenges that Cheryl so beautifully encapsulated, even though it's sombre. And you can't but disagree that if the sun blows up, then that's the end of Collingwood's football season for sure, and everything else that goes with it. We understand that. But in the meantime, or in case it doesn't, the question for me is how then should we live in response to the articulation, identification of the key existential threats, of Matt's terrific explanation of the systems and the structures that were put in place multilaterally to respond to what the generation that lived through World War I and World War II really believed was the most challenging times that the world had ever experienced. My job is to think about, well, what does all of that mean for the future? And I guess in one sense, that is a challenging task. We aren't really going to know, so whatever I say, can't be wrong until it's proven to be, and by then I'll shot through, so it'll be fine. I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet, so not heavily into crystal ball gazing, but let's just have a think about a few things. A couple of starting propositions for me. One is that the key driver of the Western approach to life has been relentless economic growth. To take, to extract, to exploit, and to persist with continual consumption in the hope of relentless economic growth. And that policy or that approach, that attitude, has monumentally failed us as humanity collectively. All colonial empires, not just the British, but them as well, all the others, all of them had that basic approach. Set up the colonies, extract whatever we can, exploit whatever we can, and make money for us. Trickle-down effect, the the population, the great unwashed, will benefit from that. What hope is there given this relentless approach? Well, I think my basic premise, and I'm delighted to see commonality between all three of us, Cheryl and Matt and I, is that the core answer to the question, what hope, is with people themselves. And the systems that are set up not to benefit humanity have to be challenged. And we can't just say that. We have to do what we can to challenge them. I was thinking about the different aspects or the different challenges that we've spoken about. The environment, economics, international security, the need for a more humane approach. We could take any one of those four and start with a global, then a national, and then a local perspective on how we respond and what difference we could make. So let me just, by way of illustration, choose the environment, since we have now become all much more aware of what climate change can really mean. Well, maybe we haven't. Actually, we're just starting to see that in a much more popular way. Let's think about it at the global level. I'm really fascinated by this morning's General Assembly decision. 121 states led by Vanuatu have just adopted a resolution to ask the International Court of Justice in The Hague, not the International Criminal Court, the international court that is the official judicial organ of the United Nations, for an advisory opinion on the legality of states, independent sovereign nation states' international legal obligations to more effectively reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it's very unusual within the structures that are in place for Vanuatu or any of the Pacific Island states, individually or collectively, to lead a major multilateral effort. But Vanuatu and Kiribati and Tuvalu, they've been living with existential threats for the last 20, 30 years as they see ocean levels rise, as they see their king tides all but overwhelm their entire landmass. And when you're only 5 metres above sea level and the king tide goes to within 2 metres of that, this is fair income for them. They are leading a multilateral effort joined by all these other countries to go to the International Court of Justice to say, what are the legal obligations? We need the pressure ramped up on the sovereign nation states that are contributing relentlessly to the circumstances that are leading to what for us is an existential threat way sooner in time than for the rest of us, especially those of us lucky enough to escape to Burnie. When COVID hit and we had the big global lockdown, this magnificent planet we're privileged to inhabit breathed a sigh of relief for about 6 weeks because all air travel stopped, most road transport stopped. The Himalayas could be seen from the big Indian cities in the north. It's like the planet said, oh, thank God for that. And it was almost an expression, I suspect, of a planetary plea for what could be. I think about ecological and environment rejuvenation. And I think no further than the coastline right here. Because in the 1960s and 70s, growing up in this place, it was disgusting. Those of you who lived here know exactly what I mean. The effluent, the waste from dioxide and from APPM, and then the acid plant was just poured relentlessly into the environment and out into Bass Strait, all of 50 metres out. The foam on a northerly or an easterly was brown and disgusting. The rocks were stained. Look at the coastline now. Just been given the opportunity to replenish itself. It's spectacular. Sorry?
Just in time for salmon farms.
There you go, just in time for salmon farms. It's hard to achieve the Paris Accords, apparently, and yet there are a number of challenges that are happening to that. One of them at the multilateral level, led by Vanuatu. But what about the national level? 3 fascinating cases for me. In excess of 2,000 Swiss grannies, average age 73 have taken their government to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that Switzerland's inadequate efforts to curb its greenhouse gas emissions are challenging their right to life. And while these 2,000 Swiss grannies, I'll call them that, I don't know, they're all grandmothers, but they're all women. Alongside them, a former French burgomaster been a little bit unhappy about France's failure to curb its greenhouse gas emissions. He's initiated a case at the European Court of Human Rights against his government for a similar failure. And a whole stack of Portuguese children, so we're crossing the generations here, have taken the Portuguese and other governments to the European Court of Human Rights. And now the European Court has to deal with those legal challenges. I'm fascinated by that. Initiatives at the national level to challenge the difference between, the gap between what states say they'll do at a multilateral event like Paris and what they're actually doing. What about in Australia? The Teals almost won the balance of power in the last federal election. Imagine if they had. I suspect the government's responses on new licences for gas exploration or for coal mines or for whatever else that threatens greenhouse gas emissions might have been very different. The interesting thing for me is that the power is with the electorate to change the system. And we saw quite a substantial threat to the bi-party system, not quite perhaps as far as it could have gone. To me, it's both welcome and ironic that more and more of us are waking up to the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander approaches to the relationship with country and the importance of caring for it. The irony, the welcome bit, is because we desperately need that knowledge. The irony is that when the British arrived here, these people were considered uncivilized savages because they were naked, because they didn't grow their vegetables in rows, they had no picket fences, and they didn't worship the same God. And we think about that now and say, really? These were the uncivilized savages? The colonial authorities really knew how best to exploit and extract and to, do such damage to the joint? Okay, we need to tap into that nationally. And what about locally? We're still taking down old growth forests. We could be a powerhouse of renewable energy. We are building a very expensive football stadium, but what about each of us, you and I? I mean, it's easy for us to think about the really wealthy people, what are they doing, to share their wealth? But actually on a global scale, every single one of us is incredibly privileged and wealthy. What are we doing individually? I think the community, the decisions that we take collectively, how we engage with each other in the aftermath of the pandemic, and the decisions that we take at the local level to challenge local government, to challenge the state government, that's where we really could make a difference. And I hope that we'll be thinking about how we do. I could, make similar observations about each of those different categories of threats, but we haven't got time for that. We really need to do some Q&A. Happy to take any questions on any of them, though. Thanks very much.
And maybe just to kick things off, I'll start with a question from online, and then in the live audience can put your hands up and a microphone will come to you. A number of questions, some of them quite lengthy. A question from David, which I'll just abbreviate if you don't mind, David. I'll put it to you, Matt. Is democracy the answer to stop war and give legitimacy to opposing answers to existential problems?
This is a fascinating question because that was the suggestion both at the end of the Second World War and indeed at the end of the Cold War, where democracy promotion was the idea that I'm tempted to sort of at some stage in my career go into international relations bumper stickers. And well, the one that Darryl would say was democracy stops wars. The idea that democracies don't go to war with each other. This is sort of the Kantian philosophy. But what it fails to acknowledge is that democracies go to war with non-democracies with relish and with rigor. And so the idea of spreading of democracies has value, but we've also seen the deep failings of it. Look at the catastrophe of Iraq. The catastrophe, the disaster of the Iraq war, the illegitimate and illegal invasion of Iraq that will continue to be a disaster for generations to come because of the horrible situation that created. All premised on the idea of a reverse domino effect of if you place a democracy in Iraq, you will democratize the Middle East and everyone will be happy. So there is value, and Tim and Cheryl both identified this. There is value in democracies in the capacity for people to make change with elected government. But when democracy imposition becomes a foreign policy goal, that is deeply problematic. And so democracies need to be a ground up, organic idea. And that's when they best succeed. The idea of imposing them has proven to be disastrous in multiple ways. I hope that answers the question. Darryl, did you want to add something? Sure.
I might just add that you've also got to question what is a democracy, because they're all quite different and of different flavours. And previously, democracies tend to go on a path. They start off young and idealistic and sort of represent the people. They get captured by power, largely economic and monetary power. And then they descend into the phase we see now in the students of Rome and Greece, where we have charismatic leaders such as Trump. We have the rich getting richer and controlling most of the flows of information. So in fact, one of the best things we can do to stop war is actually reform democracies. If you're living in a better democracy, people want to join because they see it's good. Where I speak to many people now in Africa and they say, well, we don't want to be like you. The Chinese are being lifted out of poverty. You're being pushed into poverty. You're supporting that extractive capitalism that's wrecking my country. Why would I choose democracy? So I think democracies have to take a good look at themselves as well.
It appalls me that a decision to go to war can be made in Australia by a handful of people, by part of the executive arm of government, with no accountability for that. The best that you get is, is then Prime Minister Abbott rocking up to a visit to ADF troops in Afghanistan, talking about some of the things that have been going on and resigning himself to the fact that shit happens in war. Who put them there? I mean, this is appalling to me that politicians can decide to send our forces into an armed conflict that goes on for more than a decade, that results in massive post-traumatic stress of almost everybody deployed, some of them deployed not once or twice, but 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 times into a conflict with very little clarity about what the mission actually is, and no accountability ever for that political decision. And I think, I really wish that in Australia we demanded a more rigorous process for a decision that ended up committing us to a war.
I see a few hands in the audience. Do we have a roving mic? Right here.
Thank you. I'm coming from a science background. I have a friend who I have lots of conversations with about the thermodynamics of extractive capitalism and the idea that climate change and greenhouse gases are only one of the symptoms of this whole process. And you've made that clear by talking about some of the related issues about garbage and pollution, and those are the other side effects. But the bottom line of this is that there's a distance between the extractive process and people's everyday lives. And we like our everyday lives. We like being able to go to the shop and buy new whatever we need to have a nice life and a comfortable life. And to end that extractive capitalism, we are lacking a legislative framework that says corporations must be taking into account the needs of society and as well as the needs of shareholders. So we have that aspect of it. But the second part of it is, how do we convince people that our lives need to be simpler and less reliant on all these things, like a new car, for instance?
This is a brilliant question, and it gets to the allure of capitalism. And this was Marx and Gramsci are geniuses. I mean, they foresaw this. They foresaw that the idea of that engaging in a market would be alluring and that it would be extraordinarily difficult once you saw the shiny new things to retreat from that. But as both Tim and Cheryl and I sort of alluded to, and I wish I had have done better in it, this is a different stage of capitalism that we're currently in at the moment. And I'd hoped that COVID and sort of the degree of perhaps a new Keynesian form of economics with the role of the state was going to wean us off those sort of evils of neoliberalism, but it hasn't. The allure's returned. And so I guess Tim and Cheryl, I imagine, will talk about how we can wean ourselves off the allure, but I just sort of wanted to put some... That's nice of you. Yeah, exactly. I'll put you in. I wanted to praise the value of your question and again, put some flesh on sort of where the allure comes from.
It's very alluring. And really part of the problem is we're turning to science instead of the arts and the creative sector, because what we're lacking is this grand narrative for change. And we see with people like Matt Gamow and Remakers, we're now starting to see that narrative emerging of what the different future might look like, but it's a bit late to the party. We started off with our thinking with our heads, or that analysis, or the data, the figures, and congratulations, science, you were warning us 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, we weren't paying any attention. So part of it is actually creating a different story. And this is where the much neglected and under-resourced sector, the arts, is critical. Because in revolutions, there's tend to be three phases. The first one is where people understand there's a problem. And the second phase is actually when everyone understands that everyone else thinks there's a problem. So it's that collective narrative and collective understanding. And it's going back to World War II, there was clearly a problem. There was clearly an enemy to fight. Trouble with a lot of our problems now is we're the enemy. Every time I turn on the car ignition, I'm the enemy because I'm putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So there's both the individual choices we can make, and they're quite considerable. But much more important is the conversations we can have and the advocacy we can conduct, and our constant call on politicians and leaders at every level and business at every level to take action. We heard from Tim brilliantly about the power of taking cases to court as well, which I think has a very important role.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, Catherine. Thanks for asking it and for putting it so powerfully. And I haven't got the answer because I'm not sure how to do it. But I think about it for me. What does it mean for me? And of course, I enjoy all sorts of things about life. The issue is much bigger than that. No, it's not, Timbo. You can't fool yourself like that. What are you going to do about it? What changes are you going to make? Does that mean my carbon footprint is not small travelling to The Hague? I understand that. And am I prepared to give it away and do it all, remotely? Maybe more than I used to, but not entirely. It's so many different challenges. We compromise in so many ways. And that's, that's from someone who would like or accepts the rational theory of the importance of it. What about people who don't give stuff? And there are plenty of them. So, but I can't personally say to them, I can of course, but what I'm trying to say is I can't just say, well, no point worrying about it because they're not worried about it. That's not how it works.
An online question from Bronwyn, and I'll put it to you, Cheryl. Could you please give us more information on the idea of climate refugees in Tasmania?
At the moment, you've got climate migrants, which is a very different thing. I think the law doesn't yet recognise climate refugees, although there are certainly climate refugees in the planet, largely in Africa, and in some of the Pacific Island states, people have already had to leave their villages and relocate, and in the Torres Strait as well. So the climate migrants, you could also call them doomsday preppers. That often when I speak to many friends who work in climate change, and my previous job was looking at climate for Department of Defence, and when it came time to retire, I thought, I better put my money where my mouth is, and move to a place where I had one, reminded me of home, but two, it was actually one of the best places on the planet to live out my alluring life without the disruptions of climate change. But one of the key things to take away is actually what happens outside Australia impacts Australia. So even if you can hide, but you can't run forever for climate change. Because we heard about those mobile phones, well, they rely largely on minerals dug up in Africa, particularly cobalt in Congo, and coltran, a couple of minerals there. And those of you who are not looking at Congo, because Australia hears almost nothing about Africa and almost nothing about Latin America, two critical countries for climate change. And we don't really so part of, I think, the problem, to your previous question about why aren't we getting this, is we're okay mostly in Australia. It's not really hitting home for us. That's because we don't necessarily hear the stories or connect to the people in Africa. And that's why I said have the conversations, make the connections, because I now know the regenerative agricultural team in Congo, and having known and connected to this excellent group of young men and young women who are trying to restore natural values there, I cannot not act now knowing that. Whereas before, when I was like Tim, it was an intellectual thing, and it was I get it. I'm reducing my footprint a bit, and I now have reduced it further. But yes, I'm going to have to reduce it further still. It's because I have a personal connection to the people. And that's one thing we underestimate, is that connection, deep connection to land, to ancestors and to future generations that Tim spoke about in Indigenous practice. So that's perhaps where we should start. Perhaps that's what we should be teaching in schools. That should be part of everyday life, because if you have that connection to those ancestors and to those future generations and to every life on the planet, then you're much more inclined to act. It doesn't feel unnatural to do so, and it has a great allure of itself.
I'm a philosopher and have a bit of a slant on a lot of this, but I'm also interested in international affairs. I can see us doing all sorts of things at a local level, and basically they will do stuff all to counter the existential threats that were talked about. They might mitigate them at a local level, go up high, and when the waters come up, you'll be safe for a little while until your veggie patch runs out and whatever. You can mitigate it at a local level, and if all of the local levels were motivated, they might be able to change things a few levels up. But it seems to me the real worry, and this is what I'd like to hear perhaps Matt talk about more, one that occurs to me as the likeliest candidate anyway. If you're talking about these existential threats to humanity, not just to the local people in Burnie, one of the worries is rogue actors, nation state rogue actors. And what on earth is one able to do to mitigate their behavior? We do have international institutions. Yeah, we have the UN, and we have 2 rogue actors on the Security Council, possibly 3 if you count the United States. So what the hell can be done at the highest level? And this is where, if we're going to save humanity, something will have to be done, not a whole lot of people buying organic eggs or something.
Thanks. That parallels some of the online questions as well. Who wants to kick off?
I wish I had had more time to talk in my presentation about the systemic problems. And I've been thinking when Cheryl and Tim were talking, there's 2, and there's one that's fairly sort of basic, and then there's a second that goes to your question. And so for what Cheryl and Tim were talking about, for much of our governance, the nation state, the sovereign nation state, is still in lots of regards the primary actor. Yet many of the issues that we are speaking about don't respect sovereignty, and climate change is the first of those. That climate change has no respect for borders. And then this is what we've been talking about, that most of the countries that experience the worst aspects of climate change are not those that have directly caused them. And so this is the challenge with respects to governance about how we can respond to that. The rogue actors part, Peter, is really important. And in my notes, I had, for example, the breakdown in the most recent WTO negotiations, where countries still cannot determine who is developing and who is developed. And so the idea that what your responsibilities with respects to climate change are based on a definition in breakdowns with the WTO is deeply problematic. But in this respect, I don't want to blame the West for everything, but there is a degree to which those systems that we spoke about are partly to blame. That we have for example, an International Monetary Fund and a World Bank, that because of an agreement made by the end of at the end of the Second World War, that the IMF will always be led by a European and the World Bank will always be led by an American. This is the deal. And yet we know that most of the work that those institutions do is not in Europe and it's not in the United States. And so the rogue actor question is really hard to solve because there's a whataboutism that always comes to the fore. There's the question, and this comes with human rights. It comes with what Tim and I have been talking about recently with, and I'll digress slightly, the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine. And every second utterance from Vladimir Putin is to the West. You cannot lecture us on this because you illegally invaded Iraq in 2003 and you illegally invaded Kosovo in 1999. Now, two wrongs obviously don't make a right, but there's more at fault than just those rogue actors that you point out. It's because of the bad behavior of those so-called responsible actors in the past that means that the so-called responsible actors no longer have any moral strength in pointing out these issues. And so there is an aspect in that despite my optimism earlier, there is a brokenness with respects to that, because that is a vicious cycle that we cannot escape from. And we see it play out news cycle after news cycle and every sort of, when we have meetings of these international institutions. And so I guess that's a long way of me saying that a degree of responsibility for these rogue actors needs to be held by those actors that we don't regard as rogue, but you also pointed out have rogue tendencies in the past as well.
Yes, just following on from Matt, 2 weeks ago, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin. I think that's quite a dramatic event. Of course, you can say, well, what's the prospects of it actually being executed? What difference is it possibly going to make to him? In fact, one of his first acts of defiance, apart from issuing Russian arrest warrants against the 3 judges and the prosecutor who dared to initiate this, was arrest warrants in respect to the charge of charging an innocent person for a crime under Russian law. And then the second act of defiance was to go to Russian-occupied eastern Ukraine to be seen by the media, particularly Western media, that I'm not afraid of the International Criminal Court. For me, that's a dramatic step, and the concept of a leader of one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council being the subject of an arrest warrant for which there will be no statute of limitations, it will be valid for the rest of his life. If he steps outside of Russia and possibly Belarus and a few other satellite states which wouldn't dare to arrest him, he runs the risk of being taken into custody and put on trial. Now, we could, of course, say it's just a limited thing and not going to have any effect. I think it's an attempt to try to challenge the idea that for rogue states, there is no accountability. I think that's a worthwhile initiative.
And from sort of an entirely different tack, unfortunately, about several thousand years ago, some Roman guy came up with a catchy little slogan, which is, if you want peace, prepare for war. Of course, if you want peace, that's absolutely the worst possible thing you can do, because almost every arms race does end up in war. So really, if you want peace, you need to prepare for peace. And unfortunately, we expect peace to sort of just happen. We actually don't actively prepare for it. And the time to stop Putin was probably 1990, not 2022. Or at least 2014 in Crimea. So one of the new advances now is that coming out of some work in neuroscience is an understanding that man's drive is not to dominate man. Well, certainly woman's drive never was anyway, but man's drive isn't either. And in fact, our drive is for survival. So if we finally get, and that most of the militaries are actually inching towards this. So while securitization is often a very bad thing, those who are looking deeply at threats are sort of going, actually the best hope for our survival is to work together. Now the penny's dropping slowly on that one, but it is dropping. And it encourages me that actually the drive for survival might actually be the thing. A really basic sort of factor of humanity might be the thing that actually forces us to collaborate, both from the heart, but also from the logic of, hey, unless we all do this, we all go down. So At the moment, unfortunately, we're in a little bit of a Dr. Strange-Lovian environment where the militaries of the world are going, we can win the Anthropocene. If you read the American National Security Strategy, the cognitive dissonance in it is just amazing. It's sort of like we recognize climate change and the need to collaborate, but we're going to win it. At some point in time, that cognitive dissonance is going to have to come down one side or another. So hopefully it comes down quick enough.
All right, I'm going to take two from online and combine them. Seamus asked, are there any avenues to oppose authoritarian neoliberalism, which actively undermines opportunities for democratic opposition? And a very different spin on the same question from an anonymous questioner. Here in Northwest Tasmania, those seeking to challenge destructive environmental practices are vilified by state MPs as woke greenies. Why should young people take up the mantle of challenging ecologically destructive or socially inhumane structures and systems in the face of MPs who seek to dehumanize them?
Well, I'm going to start with the second one first, because I think that's a really good question. And my children of that generation are confronted with that challenge right now. It's not just limited actually to the northwest coast of Tassie. I think it's limited. It extends across the state, not just because MPs seek to dehumanise or to criticise, but also because of legislation to restrict protest, and that's not just in relation only to protest against poor or bad or destructive ecological and environmental policies, but across the board. The way I think to change that is the electors of Tasmania demand something better of our representatives in Parliament, and for the government to be able to feel like it can pass legislation like that, clearly believes that it has sufficient electoral support to do that. And I think that's got to be challenged, and I don't see any reason why it can't be as part of a process towards the next state election. We're not prepared to accept that. Why should we? This is in a democratic system where we believe we have the right to express an opinion, which might be different to government or big business. So, yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Self-proclaimed bastions of democracies are not looking all that democratic at the moment. And I think this is an issue. And I've got four immediate examples I can think of. We've seen the protests recently in France, where Emmanuel Macron has used an executive order to push through what is clearly an unpopular decision to raise the retirement age. We've seen regular violation of COVID rules in Britain and an unaccountable prime minister who believed that he wasn't equal in the eyes of the law, that he was special, and that while numerous people were missing funerals of loved ones and operations, and there are a number of horrible stories, he's partying at number 10. We see in the United States, the country that regularly tells us what a magnificent democracy it is, in the 2020 election, a failure, the most basic failure of democratic transition, of acknowledging the winner of an election and a peaceful transition to that winner, fail. And we have in Australia the post announcement that our Prime Minister was holding multiple portfolios without telling anyone. So, sorry, that's a fifth one. That's an excellent one. So another country that identifies itself as, and in fact, premises much of its legitimacy, as Tim pointed out, on being the only democratic regime in the area, Israel, whose Prime Minister Netanyahu at the moment is pushing through legislation that will drastically undermine the role of the judiciary in a balance and a separation of powers. So the answer to that first question, Daryl, is that democracies don't look all that flash at the moment. So it's really hard to then jump up on your pedestal and go, democracies are the best.
I'm going to again take a different tack in. At the moment, we've not got terribly much options to exercise our democratic opinions. We can talk about them, once just talking about it, and we can vote once every 3, 4 or 5 years. Well, that's not a great deal of opportunity really. Or we can take protest action either. We can take protest action over a range of things with our money. We can choose not to buy things and to buy other things. And some of that is happening if you look at the choices about environmental sustainability stuff versus horrible extractive capitalism stuff. Some people are making those choices, just not enough. But the thing is now we have the technology for democracy to be much more participatory, like it used to be. It used to be a human scale thing. It used to be that you could look someone in the eye and know who the mayor was, you know who your councillors are. And you could get, and people were much more involved in the democratic process, not once every 3, 4 or 5 years, but almost sort of on a much more regular basis. And what we're seeing now is experiments with some more participatory democracy models like citizens' juries. In fact, to put an advert for one, we're going to be running a little trial of a citizens' jury on a universal participant income at EcoFest with Robin from Livewell. And what we really need to be is demanding that we're not just counted once every 3, 4 or 5 years, but actually governments ask the people on important questions far more often. After all, Google does it. You know, Amazon does it. There's all this data being collected on us and our opinions, just not by government. So why should we just be sitting back and waiting? You know, we waited about 12 years for the last government, but we should be also advocating for governments at all levels to be much more participatory, consult the people so that the students don't have, and students, not just students, by the way, it's usually old people, elders and students and young people, don't have to risk their lives and livelihoods in protest. There should be some middle ground, and I think we need to have much more people demanding that the middle ground is adopted by government, so we don't have these extremes of the vote once every so often or the protest as the two avenues of action.
There has been a considerable amount of talk about the organs of the UN, particularly the IMF and World Bank. I was wondering, do you believe transnational economic alliances such as ASEAN and BRICS can meaningfully challenge the Bretton Woods system and grant a greater amount of economic self-determination to the global south?
This is a brilliant question. And in my notes, I read somewhere the other day that as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, China is now lending as much money as the World Bank and the IMF do. And I looked at this, and I looked at this in a number of ways, and there was also an interesting news story recently that China brokered a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which I thought was extraordinary for lots of reasons. China doesn't usually do this type of stuff. And so there's two parts to your answer: that yes, there is an independence from the restrictions of Bretton Woods. But as we've seen, for example, in countries such as Sri Lanka with their experience of economic crisis, China is not an altruistic actor either. And so with the lending of the money, for example, for building infrastructure, China not only called in its loans, but takes ownership of that infrastructure as part of the deal. So the answer to your question with respects to economic, and sorry, what was the phrase you used again, please?
Economic alliances.
Economic alliances and economic self-determination is that it seems that from the rubble or the chaos of the limitations of Bretton Woods, there are other actors stepping in, but again, not creating the environment in which you, I think of optimistically, and it would be wonderful, wished would happen. And I love the question because I would like it to happen, but it seems we're having a repeat of sort of the limitations of Bretton Woods. And again, I get worried here about the role that China plays in this. And it gets back to the last question when we were talking about democracy. And I'm tempted to quote Winston Churchill, and I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but democracy is the worst kind of system except for all the rest.
I guess my question is just around, do you think that the nation state is, I guess, a long-lasting and good system of managing the world, or is it better to go towards this, I guess, borderless international order when the international order itself was created out of the nation state paradigm? So if that's where we're heading, and the potential risk to reduce down to, I guess, less autonomy, as you've pointed out, around participatory democracy, like who actually gets to run this world, and I guess this framing around rogue actors, like they're just acting based on this sovereign nation state ideology. So I'm not sure how we can be in both camps at once. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, so another great question. I think if we had all the solutions, we'd be rolling them out now. So there's a couple of thoughts on that. There's sort of like evidence that suggests that humans work well in a certain society of a certain size. And once we get up and scale up, whether it be corporations or nation states, we just really haven't cracked how to govern with the numbers and scales that we're trying to cope with now. And so far, all our attempts have not been very successful. There's a great little option for the UN Security Council based on the voting habits of African wild dogs, which I can talk to you about in a moment. That they have a sneeze voting system, which I'd just love to see. But other options are, can we harness artificial intelligence in sensible ways to be that coordinating lateral over a lot of cellular type, smaller type organisations, which we know work well. And also we are seeing the emergence of new structures. And so the counterculture structures are sort of connecting globally because they now can, and offering up alternate ways of governance that are based on more indigenous and more matriarchal systems. Because while democracy might have been the best form of government invented by patriarchies, I would argue it was not the best form of government invented by matriarchies, although they were dealing generally with much smaller numbers. So the question is, how can we draw from our past where we did have successful, sustainable societies and apply that at the scale which we have now? And that for me is one of the fundamental questions of global governance, is take the goodness of the local and apply it at the scale of global. And there's either some weird quantum stuff that may solve that based on some of the new science we understand about freaky action at a distance. And the other option may be we can do something clever with artificial intelligence, though that could go badly wrong. So there's some risk to that as well.
I love this question so much, because the evolution of the nation state is fascinating, and the idea of it as an entity. It's a PhD topic as well. And it's so the answer to your question is similar to the question was asked about capitalism. The nation state has proven itself extraordinarily resilient to change. And the reason why I say that is that when you look at independence movements, when you look at Taiwan, when you look at Scotland, for example, when you look at various other groups, what they want is a nation state. So the idea of nation state and membership of the club remains important globally, but the nation state is a relatively new phenomenon. So that doesn't mean it's going to hang around forever. And there are plenty of examples, and I love talking to my undergraduates about this. There are plenty of examples, and I think the International Criminal Court is one of them, where we have an example of cosmopolitan law, the idea that the ICC creates a set of norms that sort of breaks down those restrictions of national borders. And so I guess the short answer to your question is, I think the nation state is here for the foreseeable future, but I don't think it is the best form of political organization to respond to our current crises. But again, it's proven itself to be remarkably resilient.
I'm sorry, we're out of time completely. Sorry for that. So I will just turn very quickly over for a 30-second vote of thanks from Jim Cavey, who's our Pro-Vice Chancellor here on campus, and then I'll come back to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can come to these things, but you can't leave until you hear from the Pro-Vice Chancellor. I have three thanks that I'd like to offer. One is certainly to you in the room and online. We just wanted to thank you so much for participating in this discussion. There is hope for humanity because people like you engage in these discussions. It's through deliberation and critical thinking and insight that we develop a way of dealing with these difficult issues. Secondly, I'd really like to thank all of those who helped to organise this evening. So we've got Joe, Belinda, Savannah, Sarah, and Brandon, who've been helping us down the back, and of course, Clarissa over here in the corner. All of these folks have played a pivotal role in helping us to make this evening happen and to make it work successfully. So thank you so much for all your help there. Also to our MC, Daryl Stelmark, who's done a fantastic job to make this evening work so well. So to Daryl, thank you so much for managing this evening. You've done a great job. And finally, well, I wanted to sincerely thank our speakers tonight. These are great friends of ours. They have supported us as a university in this region forever. Matt, Tim, and Cheryl, could you please put your hands together to thank them? Back to you, Daryl.
Thank you, Jim. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you to the online audience. Sorry we didn't get to your questions. I saw my students there. We can address those questions in class. We are local people, so reach out. If we can't address your questions here, reach out to us in class or online. This material will be online. Go to the Island of Ideas page. Subscribe if you're interested to learn more and see more and do more. Thank you all, live audience and online audience, for attending. I hope you all have a great evening. Good night.